Okay, welcome to the Deliverance and Demonology Workshop. This is number 2 in a series on yoga. And so for those of you who missed the last session, I'm going to do a brief overview or introduction on the nature of yoga. So what is it? This is a religious body language of India. It is devotion in motion, a moving liturgy. Now the meditation component of yoga was developed thousands of years ago as a standalone spiritual practice to merge with the Hindu supreme reality. And this is cosmic being or cosmic consciousness. But the pose repertory, and this is what we consider to be good exercise, was developed much later as a religious rite to worship the many faces of the Hindu divine. So by and large, these dynamic poses that pass for exercise are inspired by Hindu mythology. They embody the veneration of figures from Hindu sacred literature. So the posture practice is a type of icon mimicry or role-playing of these figures from Hindu sacred literature. And this can be done on purpose or in ignorance, and most people do it in ignorance. So yoga poses send these welcome messages into the spirit realm, attracting spirits of Hinduism. Now the pose repertory can be organized into 3 main categories. First you have the passive poses. These are seated meditation poses, and they are the most ancient, and I will be discussing those in another workshop. Second, you have active dynamic poses that are named and patterned after and dedicated to Hindu gods and sages. And these are legendary, superhuman figures that are featured in Hindu action-adventure stories in texts such as the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Puranas. Third, you have active dynamic poses that are modeled after creatures and created things. So we're talking about mammals, birds, reptiles, insects, and other aspects of nature. So let me say a word about how Hindus and New Agers approach these deity, creature, and creation poses. Their attitude ranges from admiration to adulation to absorption. And their spiritual goals in practicing the poses that emulate other beings also range from modeling the attributes that are exemplified by the figure or credited to the figure, to hallowing the figure, to actually becoming the figure. So this is a progression. And this progression from modeling to hallowing to becoming another being follows really the process of meditation on an object. So meditation begins with 2. You've got the meditator and the object of meditation, and then it moves toward co-mingling, and then it ends with 1. So you have the disappearance of the meditator into the object of meditation and the manifestation or emergence of that object through the meditator. And so this process is a bit like acquisition and merger. It's a takeover and possession. So for example, shaping oneself into an animal, reptile, insect, bird, or some other object in nature identifies the practitioner with that entity for the purpose of endowing the practitioner with any desired qualities of the entity, including the spirit power of that entity. So for example, this pose right here, this is called tree pose, and the desired attributes of tree pose would be flexible stability. Oftentimes I've heard in a yoga class a teacher say, well, you may be wobbling in the pose, but your roots are sinking deep into the earth. Okay, so you're developing flexible stability. This is kind of like an initiation into the whole idea of transmutation. All right, and then here's another example. This is lion pose, and here you are emulating a raving mad lion. All right, so shaping yourself into figures that represent these mythological or legendary beings identifies you with those beings and invokes the attributes and the spirit of those beings. So this is a very personalized form of veneration because the practitioner is emulating and embodying another being. And what higher honor could you give another person than emulation, right? You're basically expressing a desire to be like that other entity or to become that other entity. So this practice of yoga as an art of spiritual shape-shifting to bond with any number of beings and ultimately to host a universal oversoul is a religious view that all yoga gurus have held. And some of them have really downplayed it. They've kind of suppressed that in order to gain the interest of a global, diversely, just a diverse clientele, especially a religiously diverse clientele. One stellar example is BKS Iyengar, and that is this modern yoga guru. He lived from 1918 to 2014, and he is perhaps singly the most responsible for popularizing the posture system in the West. And I believe the reason is because he published this book in 1966 and he got into the British educational system. So early on in his career, he kind of had credibility. So I'm going to share with you what he believes, and this is yoga philosophy, okay? And this explains why the pose system is spiritually dangerous for Christians. So he believed that the practitioner's body is a mere container. In other words, we're empty in ourselves. And that through yoga poses, a practitioner vests himself in a multiplicity of forms in order to appreciate the essential equality of all of those forms. So in other words, there's no essential difference between a human being and animals and inanimate objects. And also to identify with the formless that animates them all. This is a very impersonal view of God. It basically collapses creator and creation into one. In Hinduism, there's no distinction between creator and creation, created beings. They are one and the same. Here we have Iyengar modeling a variation on wheel pose. So in that book, which is Light on Yoga, and this is considered the Bible of modern yoga, in his introduction, he explains the significance of the posture system, and he says, this is the purpose. Number one, to commemorate and celebrate the heroes, sages, gods, and avatars of Hindu mythology as recounted in Hindu sacred literature. Number two, to honor the universal spirit in its multiplicity of forms by fashioning oneself into diverse creatures and created beings. And number three, to dissolve the individual into the formless. This is this impersonal view of a universal God that is like cosmic being or cosmic consciousness. So, you know, some of us would probably roll our eyeballs and say, so what? So what? How does that apply to me? So just how important or relevant is it, you know, to know that these poses are named after and modeled after and dedicated to these mythological and legendary characters? Because, obviously, purposeful veneration requires, number one, knowledge of myth. Number two, you have to have a meditative focus. And number three, you've got to have devotional intent. And not everybody has these, you know. So does lack of knowledge about myth, does lack of meditative focus on a mythological being, does lack of devotional intent protect the practitioner from unwanted spiritual influences? The answer is no. What most practitioners do not realize is that involuntary worship does occur. So at the most basic level of participation in yoga, which is uninformed practice and ignorance of the meaning of the poses, the veneration of these mythological beings is unintended, but it's nonetheless real. And why is that? It's because practicing yoga constitutes ritual worship in the spirit realm. So stolen worship is still worship to spirits who benefit from worship. Spirits do not require informed consent. They do not honor human will the way that God does. So they are glad that this Hindu worship is obscured as something beneficial, you know, either as exercise, a health and beauty regimen, or a performing art. But for the practitioner, ignorance is not a defense. Spirits exploit that ignorance. So, and also unwillingness is not a defense if a person participates. So participation in yoga sufficiently engages the human will. Let me explain this. So you might say no, no, no to Hinduism in your mind. Or I'm not responsible for what I don't know. Or I could care less. You might think all these things. But you say, yes, I'm interested with your body. You say, yes, I'm invested with your body. So what we do is more important than what we think. Doing yoga constitutes informed consent in the spirit realm. The act of striking poses expresses a willingness to receive everything that yoga is, and it gives these spirits license to operate in our lives. So that's how it works. Let me give you an overview of the action-oriented poses that we're going to be exploring pretty soon. So these are kind of acrobatic poses, and they pass for exercise, and they include standing poses. So we've got squats, lunges, and one-legged balances. They also include arm balances. This is where you support your entire body weight with your arms. They include inversions. These are upside-down poses, so you're flipped in the gravitational field. And then also contortions, and this is where you fold your body into very intricate origami shapes. So the maxim, form follows function, really applies to yoga poses. This is actually a maxim from osteopathy, and it means that the design of a thing reveals its intended purpose. So the physical form of a pose is going to express the meaning. It's going to indicate something about that pose. So overall, as I mentioned, these active poses are named after, shaped like, and dedicated to spirit beings from Hindu mythology. So they give homage and obeisance to Hindu deities, avatars. These are human incarnations and creature incarnations of deities, sages, heroes, and mythological creatures. Some active poses even commemorate stories from Hindu mythology in an abridged form, so they're kind of like a physical shorthand of an entire story. Active poses were created for union with these spirit beings, and collectively they are the art of spiritual shape-shifting or creature craft. So you mold your body into a shape resembling the being that you are emulating. You efface your individual identity in subordination to this other being. You mimic that being in order to become like that being and to invite that being to inhabit you. So instead of worshiping an idol outside of yourself, this is traditional idolatry where you like gaze at a statue or you gaze at a painting of a deity and you become what you behold. Instead of that, you shape your body into the idol and you become the pose that you hold, and the pose represents a spirit being in Hindu mythology. So this is a very internalized form of idolatry. And collectively, that active pose repertory is Vedic pageantry. It's kind of like a parade of icons. It's the ritual display and worship of this supreme reality of Hinduism, which is cosmic being, in all of these different countless forms. So active poses affirm the pantheistic doctrine that God is in creation, that all of creation is a manifestation of God, and all beings have the same essential God nature. And by performing these poses, a person celebrates Hindu spirit beings and affirms Hindu polytheism. Now we're going to be looking at a representative sample of these poses, but I want to give you a caveat. One is that myths tend to be kind of bizarre and appalling, and Hindu mythology is no exception. What I find really intriguing, though, is the Hindus and the New Agers. They rarely interpret the myth as the facts warrant. They usually put a positive spin on the facts, and they find something laudable in dubious cases where there's hardly a rational basis for a positive interpretation. So most myths actually make suitable tabloid material by biblical standards. You know, the behavior of a lot of these mythological beings is actually objectionable, not laudable. So one might well ask, why do these yogis bother venerating or worshiping gods and demigods and sages who behave like us on our worst days or even worse than us? And the reason is the infinite clothed in human form. So they may not act like God, but deep down they are. And according to Hinduism, deep down we are too. So let me show you a book here. This book is entitled Myths of the Asanas, the Story at the Heart of the Yoga Tradition. This is by a Jiva Mukti yoga teacher named Kaivalya. And she basically unpacks some of the myths behind the poses, and she says that we can better identify and empathize with characters who have moral defects. Well, granted, we can better identify and empathize with people who have moral defects. But the question is, why would we want to identify with and emulate and posture ourselves after someone who is morally defective? Why? You know, it seems that holiness is not an imperative in Hinduism the way that it is in Judaism or in Christianity. All right, one final qualifier, and that is that I discovered that variations on these Hindu myths abound. There seems to be no definitive or conclusive account of any single Hindu myth. So the versions that I'm going to share with you are just representative. They'll give you an understanding of the general tenor of myth, but I'm not trying to establish some authoritative version of the myth. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at the first deity that's going to be honored. This is Shiva in meditation, a meditation position. Shiva is the Hindu god of destruction, euphemistically known as the Hindu god of transformation. This is the patron deity of yoga and meditation and the arts. So this is the deity that is presiding over the entire practice of yoga. And this particular pose is a tribute to Shiva, and that is BKS Iyengar, this modern yoga guru, performing what is known as King Dancer pose. And according to Hindu mythology, all of the movement in the universe emanates from Shiva, and at the end of the age, Shiva will perform a doomsday dance and resorb the universe into himself. So this pose venerates Shiva as the beginning and the end of all movement. And here's a variation. Often there are many different variations of yoga poses. This one's a little bit more elegant. Okay, next pose. This is a tribute to Virabhadra. And this particular illustration is from a Hindu sacred text called the Shiva Purana. So it's all about Shiva. Well, we're about to look at three poses. They're Warrior 1, Warrior 2, Warrior 3. They're all tributes to Virabhadra. Who is Virabhadra? This is the offspring of Shiva, kind of an avatar. And this offspring was birthed out of a lock of hair that he ripped out of his head and cast down to the ground. This is a vengeful manifestation of Shiva. And in that particular illustration, do you see that blue figure in the center with all of the arms, the many arms? Well, those arms all have weapons, and if you look closely, you'll see that there's bloody butchery going on. There's basically a massacre around this figure. This is the vengeful avatar of Shiva. So the myth behind this pose is kind of like a ghastly Bollywood opera. Here it is. Shiva's father-in-law, who also happens to be his brother, insults Shiva's wife. And Shiva's wife happens to also be a devotee of Shiva, and her name is Sati. Well, this father-in-law, brother, excludes Shiva from a party, and Sati is so provoked by her father's rejection of her husband that she spontaneously combusts into flames. In other words, she commits suicide through self-immolation and just becomes a pile of ash. Well, on a distant mountaintop, Shiva is meditating, and he senses that there is something dreadfully wrong with his wife. And then he gets the news that she has basically committed suicide through immolation. So he rips out a lock of his hair and he casts it down to the ground in fury. And then it bores into the earth, and guess what? It emerges right on the site of his wife's ashes, and it turns into this vengeful manifestation of Shiva. And so then Virabhadra, that's the vengeful manifestation, murders the host of the party, that's the father-in-law and the brother, And he murders a lot of the guests who get in the way. So he's in a stormy rampage, basically, and his arms are shearing in all directions like a cyclone. So that is what these poses we're about to look at commemorate. They reenact this vendetta. Let's take a look at them. Warrior 1. This is Virabhadra erupting from the earth. Remember, he was a lock of hair that bored down, drilled down into the earth, and then he emerged right at the site of the ashes. So this is Virabhadra erupting from the earth. That's Warrior 1. Here's Warrior 2. This enacts him spying out and targeting the offending father-in-law, the offending brother. It also enacts him beheading the father-in-law, beheading the brother. So with a slash of the sword, decapitating that offending father-in-law. And Warrior 3 enacts him lobbing the head into the fire or impaling the head on a stake, depending on which version of the myth you read. So he's also obviously lopping the length of the party when he does that. And any kind of guests who try to intercept what he's doing in order to save the host, they also are dispatched. Well, mission complete. Virabhadra merges back into Shiva. So when you do this warrior pose sequence, Warrior 1, Warrior 2, Warrior 3, that is what you are enacting, that bloody vendetta. All right, next pose is dedicated to this deity. This is known as Hanuman, and this statue is in Ramghat. Let me tell you a little bit about Hanuman, interesting deity. This is the monkey god. He is the most popular deity in India. He's a superhero in their epic mythology, and he's the patron deity of all forms of physical culture, most especially wrestling. And in India, wrestling is not a sport, it's actually a spiritual discipline. Wrestling and yoga share some movements and poses in common. They share the sun salute. They share some squats and lunges and jumps and press-ups and those types of things. So there's a little bit of overlap between those two. This particular god of physical culture is the secondary deity that presides over yoga. And a lot of the modern yoga gurus worshipped him and had an idol of him on their altar. Now here's another statue. This is Hanuman, and this is at the Batu Caves. Notice that he's tearing open his chest wall and exposing his heart. So he is renowned for his militant devotional service to King Rama. And King Rama is a human avatar of Vishnu, the Hindu preserver god. So this is very interesting. One Hindu god is serving another god. This monkey deity is serving a human incarnation of Vishnu, the preserver deity. And we have these kinds of relationships in Hindu mythology. So Hanuman's adventures showcase a lot of occult yogic powers. One of them is flying, and that is called passage through the sky secured. Passage through the sky secured. Another one is minifying. This is shrinking yourself into a microdot. Another one is maximizing. That's enlarging yourself into a macro scale. Another one is supernatural speed, and another one is supernatural strength. Well, all of these occult powers are mentioned in this early yoga text. It's the Yoga Sutras, and this was written around 250 AD. It's actually a treatise on yoga meditation, but it contains an entire chapter on developing these paranormal powers. And the author, whose name is Patanjali, admits that these paranormal powers are actually a hindrance. They're an impediment to enlightenment because they ensnare the practitioner in the material realm. The material realm in Hinduism is considered transient at best or illusory at worst. But so anyway, it's the occult powers are considered an exciting detour that you really don't want to take. That's how but they give you instructions on how to acquire them. All right, let's take a look at the pose here. This is monkey pose. This is the tribute to Hanuman. And this pose symbolizes a flying split leap that Hanuman took off the southern coast of India over the sea to an island. when he was on a rescue mission. Now, I deliberately chose this pose because we are familiar with the splits in the West. So the question arises, is the split necessarily a yoga pose? Well, we know that the split actually has a unique history in the West, and its history is independent of the development of yoga. So I would categorize this particular pose as transnational, especially the simple form of the split that is featured in Western performing arts like ballet and gymnastics and cheerleading and so on. But if you start to do a more complex form of it, such as this, that's definitely going to be yogic, exclusively yogic. So I also want to mention that the Western splits are performed very differently from the yoga splits. The yoga splits are held as a static position, and you do it on the floor, okay? But in the Western performing arts, usually these splits are performed quickly, and they're performed in the middle of dynamic movement, and they're often performed repetitively over and over and over. So for example, the split leaps of a ballerina across the stage. She might do a series of these split leaps, and they're called grand jeté in ballet. All right, very different because it's aerial, and that's a plyometric exercise. It's ballistic. You're jumping up in the air and you're landing. It's very different from just doing the splits on the ground. Also, this example, how many of you have seen the Rockettes? They're doing a line kick. I saw them at the Scope. They were very good. So again, it's done in a split second, it's done repeatedly, it's a very dynamic form of movement. So the execution is very different in the Western performing arts. So the split would not be categorically prohibited for Christians or Jews, but its neutrality depends on how you execute it and where. If you are performing it in a yoga class, then you are basically paying tribute to Hanuman. That position, that body position is going to come under the auspices of yoga. It's going to mean what it means in yoga, and you're going to get the spiritual attachments, all right? But if you perform it in a neutral context, should be fine. You know, and so we're talking about a Western style of execution with no hint of hybridization. You're not mingling a Western performing art with yoga. And I say that because there's a lot of mingling going on. There's a lot of hybridization. Okay, so that was an example of a transnational pose. Let's take a look at another series of poses dedicated to this deity. This is Vishnu. He's the Hindu preserver god. And this statue here, which is from Singapore, depicts all of his avatars, or some of his many avatars. So this is called Vishvarupa, or Vishnu in his universal form. So at many different times, apparently, he incarnated as different human beings and different creatures. And we're going to take a look at 4 poses that are creature incarnations dedicated to this deity. All right, here, first we have fish pose. So take a look at this shape there. Can you see that that is a curvy linear design, and it kind of represents in an abstract way a fish swimming through water? All right, so that's an example of form follows function. The design reveals the purpose. Here the design is the shape of a fish, and the fish happens to be a creature avatar of Vishnu. And this pose commemorates a flood myth. Vishnu transforms himself into a fish and saves mankind from a cataclysmic flood. And this is a real short version of it. Okay, next pose. This is called tortoise. This is another creature incarnation of Vishnu. So take a look at the shape of that pose. Can you see that that resembles the humpback of a tortoise shell? Pretty clear, isn't it? So again, form follows function. The design of a thing reveals its intended purpose. The shape of this pose looks like the humpback of a tortoise, and the tortoise happens to be a creature incarnation of Vishnu. So this commemorates a myth in which the Hindu gods and demons cooperate to churn a sea of milk to produce an elixir that would make them immortal. Surprise, surprise. The gods in the Hindu pantheon don't last forever. They have an expiration date. And so they too are interested in immortality. My question is, why would you worship a God who's not everlasting or eternal? It seems to me that that confounds the very definition of God. All right, let's take a look at another variation on this pose. This is inverted tortoise. So same humpback shape of a tortoise shell, but now it's oriented differently in space. Okay? And then here's another version. This is called sleeping tortoise. This is really a contortion. Now you've got your feet hooked behind the back of your head. All right. Next creature incarnation. This is lion pose. We saw this a little bit earlier, but this practitioner is pretty imposing, pretty intimidating. So this resembles a raving mad lion. Would you agree? I mean, he's distorting his face into a gargoyle. He's crossing his eyes. You can't really see the eyes crossed there, but he's sticking out his tongue and he's clawing his hands. So this pose commemorates a myth in which Vishnu avenges himself against a contemptuous person who insults a Vishnu devotee. In other words, mocks the worship of Vishnu. So Vishnu transmogrifies himself into this lion and then rips out his adversary's intestines. And that's what this pose is commemorating. Delightful. Okay, now, here we have some historic photos. This is BKS Iyengar, famous modern yoga guru, modeling lion pose. When I first saw this in his book, I thought, my goodness, he looks like a portal to hell there.
Yeah, yes.
And yeah, that one is really, he's really scary. The other ones aren't scary. Here's another historic photo. This is another fairly famous modern yoga guru. He is Bikram Choudhury, kind of better known as the guru of hot yoga. Have you ever heard of hot yoga? It's where they have the room temperature up, way up, basically to simulate conditions in India. There's a whole backstory about that. But anyway, this man is quite a spicy character. He quite controversial. He actually tried to copyright a series of poses, which is ridiculous. It's like claiming an intellectual property right in Santana Dharma, which is the eternal religion for Hindus. Well, I think that that lawsuit did not go well for him. He also franchised a lot of studios, and he sued his students for infringements, different types of infringements. He collected a lot of Rolls Royces while he was here, and he was involved in sex scandals. Ultimately, he lost in court. There were some monumental judgments against him, and he went back to India, to Mumbai, to escape collection of those judgments. So a little bit about a modern yoga guru who kind of got ensnared in the materialism of the West. Okay, cow face pose. This is the last in the series of creature incarnations of Vishnu. This pose is actually a tribute to one of Vishnu's human incarnations. That is Krishna. Some of you may have heard of Krishna. So check this out. This is kind of a complicated series. You've got Vishnu, the Hindu preserver god. He has a human incarnation named Krishna, and Krishna has a creature incarnation, which is the sacred wish-fulfilling cow. So this is a mascot to that. I actually cannot see the cow in that pose. So that is one where I don't see form follows function. Someone would have to explain that one to me. We're going to look at another series of poses dedicated to a Hindu sage named Marichi. Now, he was not very sagely. He was the son of Brahma. Brahma is the Hindu creator god. You've got a trinity in Hinduism. You have the creator god Brahma, the preserver god Vishnu, and the destroyer god Shiva. Well, these poses, you'll see, are quite advanced. They require a lot of flexibility, and so typically only very advanced practitioners in Ashtanga and Iyengar yoga are going to be performing this. But this is Marichi A, and we have B, C, and D. We're going to look at those, and I'll tell you the myth. So this is Marichi B. Here's the myth. Marichi cursed his subservient wife for a conflict of duty and petrified her into stone. Why did he do that? Why did he petrify her into stone? Well, she had a moral dilemma. She was busy washing his feet. There was a knock at the door, and she thought, uh-oh, do I continue washing my husband's feet, or do I go greet the guest? And the guest happened to be the father-in-law. Well, she abandoned the task of washing the feet. She went to greet the guest, the father-in-law, and Marici was very upset. So he cursed her, and she became petrified into stone. Here's Marici C. So the myth, I don't know if it sympathetically portrays the plight of the hapless wife, but it seems to be kind of a covert social criticism on the abuses of women in India, ironically featuring a sage as the abuser. On the other hand, maybe I'm looking at this through Western eyes, and the fact that the abuser is a sage might serve to legitimize the abuse. I don't know which. We'll take a vote after this is over. Okay, Marici D. This is the most contortionistic. So I think that the poses are aptly named and patterned after Marici because the myth suggests that he was kind of a compressed, twisted, bound up character. And these poses are compressed, twisted, and bound up. You see that? All right, next. Vasistha. This is a pose dedicated to a Brahmin priest named Vasistha. He's also the son of Brahma, the Hindu creator god. Now, he owned a wish-fulfilling cow that he protected from theft through his occult powers. And that cow was coveted and repeatedly targeted for abduction by an envious warrior king named Vishvamitra. So this protracted conflict ensued, and it involved devastating losses on both sides. So the conflict, I think, was as much, if not more, a contest of occult powers as it was a dispute over a cow. Vasistha released occult power through a sacred chant, and you may have heard of this, Om. This represents the Hindu supreme reality, which is cosmic being or cosmic consciousness. So when he released that occult power through that sacred chant, he annihilated Vishvamitra's entire army. And I don't know what the moral of the story is. Maybe it's that one magic cow is worth more than a whole host of men. Well, this is the simple version, and this I would consider, again, to be a transnational pose. So there's some overlap between yoga and Western calisthenics. This one is an upper body core conditioning exercise if performed in a Western calisthenic routine in a gym, okay? So it's got a legitimate use here. But if you start to add things on or you perform this in a yoga class, it's going to come with spiritual attachment. So here's an example of an addition. This is basically two yoga poses combined into one. You've got tree pose plus side plank. That's definitely yogic. And then here you have half lotus, bound half lotus plus side plank. That's definitely yogic. Two yoga poses combined into one. And then here we have extended hand to big toe pose to the side plus side plank. So again, that's more complex, 2 in 1. So the neutrality of this pose is going to depend on how you perform it and where you perform it. If you perform it in yoga, it's a tribute to Vasistha. All right, the next pose. This is Vishvamitra. This is known as flying warrior pose. Now, if you were learning this in a gym class, you might not know that this is dedicated to a sage if they use the English translation. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the rub with a lot of these poses. Nobody tells us the myth, and nobody tells us the name of the pose. Well, this is dedicated to Vishvamitra, and we already met that guy in the previous myth. He's the bellicose warrior king who was coveting that wish-fulfilling cow and repeatedly trying to abduct it. And he was the one who got embroiled in this escalating conflict. Well, a little bit about him. To him is ascribed a legal text, an Ayurvedic medical text. And Ayurveda, by the way, is not just Indian medicine. It's also a religious practice. It has spirit power in it. Also credited to him is most of the Rig Veda. This is a collection of Hinduism's most ancient sacred hymns, and it includes the national sunrise chant, the Gayatri mantra, which we were exposed to in the last workshop. So, more about him. Here's another practitioner performing this pose. Through sheer willpower, this is the myth, through sheer willpower and practice of austerities for millennia, we're talking about thousands of years, Vishvamitra reformed himself and transformed himself. I want to give him applause. So he jumped rung in the Hindu caste system, and he acquired a string of ever more illustrious spiritual titles. He started off as Rajarshi, and then he became Rishi, and then he became Maharishi, and then he became Brahmarshi. And these are, more elevated titles. So he turned his truculent, green-eyed, grabby self, the one that was like coveting the magic wish-fulfilling cow, into everybody's darling, the friend of everybody. And that's actually what his name means, everybody's darling, the friend of everybody. Well, I gotta make a comment about this. So this is a myth of self-reformation and self-transformation. And it highlights one of the many differences between Hinduism and Christianity. So Hindus believe in the moral perfectibility of human beings, that we are capable, through supreme effort, of becoming morally perfect through religious works. Okay? Well, Christians maintain the exact opposite, and I think that history proves it, because we've not yet established a utopia so far. And that is that humans are incapable of being morally perfect, even in spite of, whatever ascetic practices we try to do. So instead of trying to perfect ourselves through religious works, we rely on God, who alone is morally perfect, to rescue us from ourselves and from our tendency toward moral corruption. All right, that was my comment. Let's take a look at the next pose. This is a tribute to Ashtavakra. Ashtavakra was a spiritual prodigy while still in his mother's womb. And he was such a spiritual prodigy that he repeatedly corrected his scholarly father's mispronunciation of hymn recitations from the Rig Veda, which was a big no-no. You don't correct your father, especially not your scholarly father. So the father got so provoked that he repeatedly cursed his son, and he was born a deformed cripple. And there you go. That particular pose, I think, aptly commemorates the sage, because it's kind of awkward looking and lopsided. You see that? The legs are sticking out to one side. It's not symmetrical, it's asymmetrical. It's awkward and lopsided. All right, next, Kundinya. This is also known as flying splits. And this is dedicated to Kundinya, a sage and devotee of the Hindu elephant god Ganesh. Let me tell you a little bit about Ganesh, because I went to India on a missions trip in the Maharashtra area, and I saw that every single taxi cab driver had an icon of Ganesh, the Hindu elephant god, on the dashboard. And I thought, well, why is that? Found out Ganesh is the remover of obstacles. And if you've ever been to India, the traffic there is insane. It is probably the most hazardous and the most chaotic in the entire world, and I am not exaggerating. It's amazing that people can actually live through it. So all these taxi cab drivers had the patron deity Ganesh, the remover of obstacles, on their dashboards. I don't think it worked very well. So, the myth about Kundinya, he proved to his skeptical wife the importance of sacred grass in grass-decking rituals of Hindu idols. So he sent her on an errand to weigh the grass. And there was this scale, and one pan and the other pan. So she put all of the sacred grass in one pan, and then all of the gods climbed into the other pan, and one of the gods had a whole bunch of gold. Well, guess which pan weighed more? It was the sacred grass that weighed more than all of the gods and all of the gold. So, let me show you another practitioner performing that pose. Flying splits, a dedication to Kundinya, a sage and a devotee of the Hindu elephant god Ganesh. So this grass is used in rituals of several Hindu deities. And basically, you completely deck the body of the idol with this grass, except for the face. And there are 3 deities that get this superb treatment. One is Ganesh, that deity I just talked about, Shiva, the Hindu destroyer god, and Shakti, who is a consort of Shiva. I'll be mentioning more about that. This is another variation. These people are highly accomplished. Would you agree? I say, God, deliver them from hijacking, because they obviously have a lot of discipline, and they are obviously very talented. All right, the next pose is based on a myth that is illustrated right there. Do you see the figure inside of the fish? Well, this is not Jonah. It's got a different myth behind it. This is dedicated, this next pose we're going to look at is dedicated to Matsyendra. He is considered a guru and medieval co-founder of Hatha Yoga. Now this guy was actually a real person, but you'll see he's also legendary. So apparently he learned the secrets of Tantric Yoga. And Tantric Yoga is the path of sex. You know, how to get enlightened? Well, you can use occult sexual rituals to get enlightened. And he was learning this by eavesdropping on a private lesson that Shiva was giving to his consort. So while inside the fish's belly, he started to practice these occult arts. And then after he got released from the fish, he started to crave the lascivious life of a king. So he decided to use one of these occult powers to project himself into the king's body. Why did he do that? Well, he wanted to copulate with the queen. And he also wanted to copulate with the king's entire harem. So that's why he projected himself into the king's body. Ultimately, he languished in a forest of beautiful thighs. That's what the myth says. Until rescued by his disciple. Whew, getting hot in here. Okay. So, by the way, that is one of the occult powers that is mentioned in this book, this treatise on yoga meditation that has an entire chapter on developing paranormal powers. All right, let's take a look at that pose. That's it. Kind of, you know, appropriate for cramped quarters. If you're inside a fish, you don't want to be doing spread arms and spread legs, right? This is more compact. Okay, the next pose is dedicated to Goraksha, and this is the disciple of the guru we just learned about. So this disciple is also the other co-founder of medieval Hatha Yoga, and apparently he's a real person but also shrouded in legend, because purportedly he was born of magical ashes that were flung on a dung heap. Now he rescued his guru from sexual stupor. How did he do that? Well, he exercised one of these occult powers, and he shape-shifted himself into a woman in order to mingle with the king's harem, so he wouldn't be detected, right? He shape-shifted himself into a woman, and he became one of those ladies in the harem, and then he skinned his guru's son to shock him back onto the path of enlightenment. You know, that required strong treatment, I guess, to deliver him. All right, now we're going to take a look at a series of poses that are tributes to creatures. This is Cobra pose, and the pose obviously mimics the partially erect stance of a cobra. If you've ever seen a cobra lift up and flare its hood, this is the imagery of that particular pose. Well, the snake has very special importance in yoga and Hinduism, so we're going to take a look at some of the correlations. First, let's take a look at Shiva again. Remember, this is the patron deity of yoga, meditation, and the arts. Do you see that he's got snake armlets? Snake armlets. He also has a snake necklace. He has a cobra around his neck. And there's one more thing that I want to point out, which is not really evident. If you look up at the stack of coiled hair, at the very top is actually the face, the head of a woman, emerging from the crown of his head. Let me point it out. That's a little bit hard to see there. But what that represents is his consort Shakti, and she represents a snake energy that gets activated in yoga. And that particular, the emergence of the snake out of the practitioner's head is supposed to be associated with enlightenment. So it coincides with enlightenment. All right, now, another example of snake imagery. This is Patanjali. He is a Hindu sage, and he is the putative author of this book I keep referring to. Amazing. This was written in 250 AD. Now, he is a hybrid being. You see there that he's half man and half snake. Lower half is a snake, upper half is a man. And according to Hindu myth, he is the 1,000-headed serpent of infinity in the guise of a man. Well, how did he get to be that way? He was initially just a serpent, and he eavesdropped on another secret discourse between Shiva and one of his many consorts. Obviously, Shiva had a lot of secret discourses. Well, Shiva detected this serpent in that remote jungle, and as a punishment, he consigned him to share yoga with human beings. And human beings were freaked out, and they violently assaulted him. Here's another image of him. So, he went back to Shiva, and on Shiva's advice, he adopted the disarming form of that human sage Patanjali. Although I don't know how disarming if you're a hybrid being and half of you is a snake. But anyway, this man was kind of like the first major expositor of yoga philosophy. And if that's the case, and he's a serpent in disguise, that makes yoga snake philosophy, my friends. And who is the snake in the Bible? Snake. Yes. Now, Iyengar, that modern yoga guru that we saw at the very beginning and kind of sporadically throughout, he considered Patanjali, this hybrid snake man, to be one of his gurus, even above and beyond his human guru, Krishnamacharya. Wild. All right, now, one more thing about snake and its importance in yoga philosophy. All of these yoga practices, we're talking about the poses, the hand gestures, the muscle locks, the breathing techniques, all of these are designed to quicken, awaken a dormant serpent energy in the body. This is Hindu, Hindu worldview, basically. So, in the literature, this Kundalini snake is described as a coiled serpent that is slumbering at the base of the spine. And when you start doing yoga, you will rouse it from its dormant state, and you will activate it, and it will uncoil, and then it will rise up in a linear path, kind of parallel with the spine, and it will pierce these chakras, the successive tiers of chakras, until the last one, it will actually erupt out of the crown of the head, and the person will merge with cosmic being or cosmic consciousness. You see that depicted right there in that illustration. You see the snake, and then it's erupting out of the crown of the head, and it's kind of exploding into the universe. That's describing the moment of realization that you don't exist. Only universal consciousness exists. Okay. Now, this particular pose I would consider to be a transnational pose. In other words, it's got there's a similar body position in Western calisthenics. And it's the middle one, well, it's the bottom two if you're looking at that illustration. Now, there's a big difference in the way it's executed in yoga versus the way it's executed in Western calisthenics. In yoga, you actually push with your hands off of the ground in order to lift your chest, and you get a nice abdominal stretch. In Western calisthenics, you're not using your hands, you're engaging your back muscles. This is a spinal extension exercise. So you're contracting your back muscles to lift your torso up off the ground unsupported. So this is actually, kind of strenuous. And there are different versions of it. There's the ATY exercise, and this is kind of showing some of it. Here is Superman pose, It's a little bit like it, especially the upper half of the body. It's also a little bit like another pose called locust in yoga, where the bottom half of the body is lifting up off of the ground. But some of you may have actually performed this in a gym. Sometimes it's combined with dynamic movement, so you have the arms and the legs opening and closing, so it's much more dynamic. And then finally you have the swimmer exercise. This is also performed in Western calisthenics, and you're paddling the arms and the legs. So again, the similar body position, but targeting the muscles in an entirely different way. All right? And here we have Cobra again. Do you see the difference? Let's go back. So she is lifting her chest off the ground unsupported. She has to contract her back muscles to do that. She's got to engage her back muscles. It's a spinal extension exercise. This woman, the yoga practitioner, is using her hands to push against the ground and lift her chest. And what she's getting is an abdominal stretch. All right? She's not engaging her back muscles. Okay, eagle pose. This one is dedicated to the king of all birds and a demigod in Hinduism. This is a symbol of Vishnu, the Hindu preserver god. And also, this is his charger. What is a charger? This is a live chariot. So Vishnu gets around by riding on this live chariot, this eagle. Here's another version of it, kind of low to the ground. Well, in Hindu mythology, the eagle, whose name is Garuda, is actually a hybrid being, half bird, half man. And a lot of Hindus will petition Garuda when they have a snake bite, when they've been bitten by a snake, because in the wild, the eagle is a natural opponent to snakes. Here's another variation. This is eagle pose plus shoulder stand. So she's upside down there. And here's yet another version. This is eagle pose plus handstand. Okay. Here we have another creature pose. This is peacock pose. And this is the sacred national bird of India. It's associated with many Hindu gods. And two more practitioners. This is peacock pose plus lotus pose. And then finally we have wounded peacock. This man is incredible. He's supporting his entire body weight on one hand. Do you see that? God deliver him, because he's obviously very dedicated. All right, we're going to look at two other related poses, crow and crane. These are similar but different. Crow pose, you see there the arms are bent. You have bent elbows. They form a ledge on the back of the arm, and you prop your legs up on that ledge. That's crow pose. Crane is slightly different. The arms are straight and the knees are higher. They're closer to the armpits. Let's go back. Crow pose, you see it's lower, the arms are bent. Crane, the arms are straight and the knees are positioned higher on the backs of the upper arms. Well, okay, so the crow or crane basically has oracular significance in Hinduism. If you see a crow or a crane, or you hear the cry of a crow or a crane, this can serve as a sign. It could either be an auspicious sign that bodes well for you, or it could be an omen that bodes evil. Now, I'm going to give you an example of a legend. According to one Hindu legend, there was a priest who was in the city of Puri, India, who saw a crow nosedive into the Bay of Bengal. All right, so he saw this sign and he thought to himself, this is a good omen. He interpreted that as an auspicious sign that this was the right location to build a temple to Jagannatha. And Jagannatha is a fierce or ferocious aspect of Krishna. So just to get back into the complicated ways of Hinduism, you have Vishnu, the Hindu preserver god. He has a human incarnation called Krishna, and Krishna has a ferocious incarnation called Jagannatha. You got the sequence? Well, anyway, in a yearly festival, hundreds of Indians pull this towering 60-foot cart under whose wheels Hindu devotees have reputedly cast themselves. It's kind of like throwing yourself under the bus. And from this rite to Jagannatha and this apocryphal account of people voluntarily maiming themselves or voluntarily killing themselves under rolling cartwheels comes the English word juggernaut. Have you ever heard that word juggernaut? Have you ever used it in a sentence? I have. It means any indestructible, colossal, machine-like force that inspires mindless submission and crushes all obstacles in its path. So this is actually, our word juggernaut is based on this ferocious avatar named Jagannatha. Bet you didn't know that. So, and here is another version of this pose called side crow. So it's asymmetrical. You see both legs are propped up on one arm. All right, rooster. So rooster does not have any Hindu myth associated with it as far as I know, but like all the creature poses, it carries a connection with ancient shamanic animal imitation. All right, and I'm going to read to you a quote from a Shivananda yoga teacher, Swami Radha, because this is kind of typical for what you would get in a yoga class. If you were performing a creature pose, what would the instructor say to you? Here's an example. So Swami Radha recommends reflecting on the qualities of the rooster while in this pose. Quote, observe how the physical position relates to the symbol of the rooster as a herald of dawn, or one who awakens the glorious sun. And here's another version of it. This is called Upward Rooster. Continuing with the quote, before going into the pose, review your mind for areas of darkness, negativity, pessimism, fear. As you do the pose, bring to mind the rooster awakening the sun, dispelling darkness. Keep your focus on light, repeating the divine light mantra as support, unquote. So, here's another example, and this is called Side Rooster, and this is BKS Iyengar performing it. That's a historic photo. In that guided meditation or visualization, animal imitation slides right into animism, and that's the belief that the natural world is endued with spirituality, with spirit. So in that guided visualization, you heard that the rooster and the practitioner really both possess the divine light in themselves in equal measure, okay? This is very Hindu in thinking. So there's a general tendency among New Age practitioners to approach these creature poses as an exercise in totemic transfiguration, even if they have to draw on a bricolage of world myths. And here's an example of drawing on a bricolage of world myths, kind of a bizarre synthesis of different creatures. So this creative license is totally in line with the historic development of Hinduism. Hinduism is an incredibly complex, complicated religion because it's was born out of layers and layers and layers of accretions. Okay, they just adopted and adapted, synthesized everything. Also, it's in line with yoga. Yoga poses are actually kind of an Eastern form of transubstantiation, if I may use that term without offending Catholics. So you know in communion, Catholics believe that the elements of communion, the bread and the wine, are transubstantiated. They're converted into the body and blood of Christ. Well, Hindus believe that the practitioner's body, by assuming yoga poses, is converted into divinity in some way, either by mystic appropriation of attributes of a divine being, or by mystic convergence with a divine being, or by mystic transmutation of the practitioner's body into a divine being. That's how they think about these particular poses. And we're involved in that tradition when we do them. Okay, shape-shifting, that's the theme. So what conclusion can we draw from these many examples of yoga poses? Here's what Sajoman, a Sanskrit scholar, and yoga instructor says about the symbolic treatment of yoga poses. And this is a quote. The yoga poses are assumed to have an inner nature that is associated with their specific name. And we've seen that. In other words, there is a mystical realization content connected with each particular pose. The practitioner becomes the embodiment of the essence of that pose. The yoga poses thus have a much greater dimension than the physical elements. This is not immediately noticeable to someone who is not familiar with the language. And he's talking about body language. So I think a lot of Americans are not familiar with this type of mystical body language. So for a Christian or Jew to strike poses like this that have religious significance in Hinduism is really to become a living statue for Hindu gods, demigods, and sages, and so on. Technically, this physical performance, even if it's intended as exercise or physical therapy, is a breach of several related commandments. And you can probably think of what they are. There's several related commandments against making an idol, worshiping an idol, worshiping God on pagan altars or in pagan ways. So these yoga poses are an internalized form of idolatry. Okay? Instead of carving a statue of a creature out of wood, instead of sculpting a statue of a creature out of clay, instead of forging a statue of a creature out of metal, the practitioner fashions her flesh into the shape of the creature. So this is self-made creature craft. By the way, that's really creepy, isn't it? She is shape-shifting into a locust. But that's actually, I just found that online. It's not, there is a pose called locust pose. I just remembered. I didn't show it to you. There's a pose called locust pose, so that would have been perfect. All right, so here are the two familiar scriptural injunctions against creature craft, which we see so brilliantly modeled right there in that very creepy picture of the girl becoming a locust. Here's the one from the Old Testament, and I have adapted it to really bring out the application to yoga. You shall not make for yourself or out of yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, eagle or crow, or that is in the earth beneath, cow or tortoise, or that is in the water under the earth, fish. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. That's Exodus chapter 20, verses 4 and 5. So those were examples of poses we saw, right? That's from the Old Testament. Here's from the New. Professing to be wise, yoga practitioners became fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, like these mythological sages, Marichi, Vishvamitra, Matsyendra, and so on. And birds, like rooster and peacock, and four-footed animals, like dog and lion, and creeping things, like cobra. Romans chapter 1, verses 22 through 23. So you see the application to yoga. All right, all of this is really a wolf in sheep's clothing. Okay? Many Christians sense that there is something fundamentally wrong with yoga. So they try to secularize it and sanctify it through deletions and additions. So secularizing yoga entails deletions. You're basically censoring really overt aspects of Hinduism in the practice. So for example, you would completely gut the practice of Hindu artwork, religious symbols, devotional music, altars to deities and gurus, chanting of Sanskrit mantras, tales of myths, and lectures on chakras. All of those things would be cut, all right? That would be secularizing the practice. Sanctifying yoga involves adding things that are considered sacred in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So for example, you would arbitrarily christen those poses by renaming them with biblical names, biblical themes. You would also add a Christian set design and play Christian devotional music and incorporate readings or recitations from the Bible and prayer. Now, the attempt to revamp yoga is a clear admission that yoga is wrong from the get-go, right? If you have to scrub it, that means it's dirty. Yeah? So these spiritual makeovers are not only lame, but they're also presumptuous. You know, the fact is that no human being has the power to redeem anything. We don't have the power to redeem. Only God has the power to redeem. And he only redeems people by the blood sacrifice of Jesus Christ. God does not redeem human works, and especially not works that human beings have created in collaboration with spirit beings or demons. Such works are banned for total destruction. They are an abomination to him. All right, so I'm going to use a really crass analogy to drive home a point that the yoga posture practice is objectionable. And that is, please humor me on this, okay? Go-go dancing for Jesus. By the way, I saw some pole dancing for Jesus that's coming out of Texas. This is not too far-fetched. So let's say that I really like go-go dancing as exercise, and I want to dovetail it with worship to Jesus, but I do recognize that there are some objectionable elements in go-go dancing. So I decide to revamp it according to my sensibilities. First, I'm going to censor that practice. I'm going to eliminate all of the objectionable elements as I perceive them. So we're going to remove the bar scene. We're going to remove that haze of tobacco smoke. We're going to remove all of the nasty boudoir photography on the walls. We're going to remove the raunchy bump and grind music. We're going to remove that bar crowd of leering patrons and also the hey baby scripts. We're going to remove that, okay? And we're going to remove the scanty costume of G-string, fishnet tights, and whirling pasties, okay? That is all censored. Then I'm going to add these Christian devotional elements. I want you to envision this. We're going to have a Christian set. Can you picture this? We're going to have clouds, doves, angels, votive candles, and scallop drapery. Does it sound elevating and lofty? We're going to play some inspiring worship music, and I'm going to wear a long, lovely, flowing liturgical gown. And I will recite scriptures, and I will pray prayers in between moves. And I will perform just for an audience of one. And in my case, I nominate the Heavenly Father. However, I'm going to retain all the same moves. Torso undulations, pelvic writhing, pelvic thrusts, breast shimmies, buttock wagging, leg spreading, full body shuddering, and tongue flickering. Thumbs up, Jesus? No? What's the matter? It's the physical moves, right? The physical moves are themselves the problem. This is the problem with yoga, and nobody sees it. It's because the practice is idolatry, and God considers idolatry adultery. That's why I used that really crass analogy, but doesn't it drive home the point? Amen. Yep. Okay, so it's so much better to dance with Jesus. Now, when confronted with the charge of idolatry, Christians offer 3 basic defenses, and I did that when I was practicing yoga. Number 1, ignorance. Number 2, good intent to exercise. And number 3, good intent to worship Jesus or the Heavenly Father. So I want to debunk these quickly. First, we've got the claim of ignorance, and this goes something like this. I know nothing. I know nothing. I know nothing about the religious significance of yoga. Well, let me just say this. Christians have a responsibility to do research about anything that's controversial. Would you agree? About anything that could potentially compromise them. Yes. Yeah, and that responsibility, P.S., cannot be passed on to someone else. You can't pass that on to a Christian yoga instructor or a Christian, a pastor who hosts yoga in his church. All right, so failing to do research is negligence, and there are repercussions for negligence. Here's the main point. Ignorance of the facts does not change the facts. Right? So you're still implicated by what you do in ignorance. You're still going to be held accountable. And ignorance is also not a defense in a court of law. Look, if I violate a statute in the land and I wind up in a court of law in front of a judge, he's not going to exempt me from punishment on a plea of ignorance. Well, if that's true with a human law, it would also be true of God's law. And God's law is above man's law. The most you could get with God is this, a commuting of the sentence. He would probably reduce the penalty some. And why do I say that? Because of this verse. That servant who did not know his master's will, yet committed things deserving of stripes, shall be beaten with few stripes. Luke chapter 12, verse 48. So congratulations, you'll get few stripes rather than many. All right, so that's the claim of ignorance. Now we've got a claim of good intent to exercise, and that goes something like this. Yoga is just exercise for me. It's nothing else. I don't intend anything else by it. Well, your good intent to exercise does not make yoga non-religious, and it does not void the spirit power in yoga. Yoga is not mere exercise. It's the practice of religion in the guise of exercise, and that's what makes it tricky. So you're wanting exercise, and only exercise does not make it so. The spirit realm recognizes yoga for what it is, and it's going to piggyback on the practice, and that's the problem. Spirits will see you mimicking these Hindu spirit beings, and they will land where they are lauded. They will land where they are lauded. All right, and then this last claim, which is good intent to worship, and this goes something like this, and I said this, I'm offering yoga to God, not to those Hindu spirit beings. Well, the God of the Bible does not accept second-hand worship that commemorates and celebrates other gods. He does not accept recycled, repurposed pagan worship that memorializes and lionizes other gods, that was inspired by other gods, that was dedicated to other gods, that was designed to enshrine them, to revere them, to summon them, and that also operates by principles of a false religion. It's the height of presumption to think that God delights in pre-owned worship of false gods. I used to think that. And now I'm like, what was I thinking? All right, so if you offer yoga to Jesus or the Heavenly Father, what this amounts to is dual communion. Yes, you are indeed worshiping the Lord with all your heart, with good intent, with a clear conscience, but you are not worshiping Him in truth according to biblical injunctions. Okay, you're worshiping Him in spirit, but not in truth. So there's a problem with this, and that is that spirit ownership is real. Just as there is a Holy Spirit associated with Christ, there are spirits associated with Hinduism, and Hinduism is not without power. And the power of Hinduism derives from its ritual sacrifices that attract these spirits. And yoga is one such ritual sacrifice. So if you engage in yoga, you are basically inviting Hindu spirits, you're hosting them. And this is why the Apostle Paul says, my beloved, flee from idolatry. That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 14. He also says, for the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God, and I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot sit at the Lord's table and partake of communion, and also the table of demons. That's in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 19 through 21. So dual communion is inevitable when a Jew practices yoga or when a Christian practices yoga. And the book of Acts sets the New Testament standard for Christians. 3 times, converts to Christ are charged to refrain from anything idolatrous. I'll read it to you. Abstain from and avoid anything that has been polluted by being offered to idols. That's Acts chapter 15, verse 20. And again, abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols. Acts chapter 15, verse 29. And then again, keep yourselves free from anything that has been sacrificed to idols. Acts chapter 21, verse 25. So let's ask the question, has yoga ever been offered to idols or false gods at any point in human history? Yes. Is it still being offered to idols or false gods even today?
Yes.
Well, then we must refrain from yoga to fulfill all righteousness. Jesus said, if you love me, keep my commandments. So that is the end of number 2. We were looking at the myths behind the poses. And I think